From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I have to confess, I find myself very much in the position of being the reluctant teacher turned eager student listening to the fine set of talks that we've just heard, and people who are actually sitting down and doing email preservation in a way that I have not done since writing that report many years ago. So while I'm very grateful that everybody finds it helpful, believe me, I have as many, if not more, problems with email preservation, starting with my own account, as all of you do, which I did check last night, has over 74,000 messages in the inbox, 3,920 of which are completely unread and probably will remain that way. I'd like to start by thanking, actually, Aaron and Kate, who were the driving forces behind organizing this event. And I'd like actually for us to give them a quick round of applause because I know the amount of work they put into it. When I wrote this report many years ago, a lot longer actually than 2011, I think I started it in 2009, it actually was not a topic that I had chosen, but one that was kind of thrust on me at the end of a sabbatical. I'd actually had a wonderful opportunity to study for about 9 months or so the OAS Reference Model and to try to find some ways to apply it in our own institutions, irrespective of format. At the end of this project, I was actually approached by Neil Biography, who asked if I would write about email preservation. I thought, wow, this is a really wonderful opportunity to learn about something that I need to learn more about. But the email preservation challenges that we had in 2009 at the University of Illinois are very much with us. I was very eager actually to hear and very much appreciated April's sort of airing of the dirty laundry at the University of Michigan, where a lot of time and effort was put into designing potentially a big project to do email preservation, which then failed because we have had very similar experiences at Illinois where we've put a lot of time and effort into writing reports, designing potential digital repository infrastructures, and as those of you who face the news know, Illinois faces a budget crunch, and it will all come to naught probably at this point. So we're very much in a position of needing to catch as catch can. As I said, I'm very much the reluctant teacher turned students here, and all I can really say for the presenters is, wow, you really give me a lot to think about at the university as we look toward the next steps of actually setting up programs to arrange and describe email. We do have several accounts that we are currently dealing with at Illinois, so I'll try to touch on those briefly in my talk here. But really what I'd like to do is just sort of summarize my own personal takeaways from today. And what I like to do is sort of compare and contrast some known items, some things that I think we know what to do or what we can do with items that are unknown or where we have a need for additional work or research at this time. So we'll kind of do a little bit of a duality here, knowns versus unknown. And I'd like to just start with a fundamental point here. And I think this actually is a little bit more settled than it was when I wrote the report back in 2011. I think at this point we can safely assume and say that we, as records managers, as archivists, are going to take a life cycle-based approach, and we are going to take a custodial model for email preservation. This was very much not known, at least to me several years ago in our own institution. We were looking at partnering with several other groups within campus to do custody. We were looking at trying to do very active intervention prior to email coming to the archives, but I think it is very much settled that we will not be doing that. And I think the second point, my big takeaway from today, is that the OAS reference model really will be and should be and must be the structuring sort of process that we use to think about email preservation. What that means in particular is that we will do good or maybe not so good intervention prior to email coming to an archives or to a library. We can provide guidance, but we can't count on it being implemented regardless of what context we're in. We will be dealing with records creators at the point at which they either leave, retire, or pass on. We will be doing an appraisal step, just like we would have been with traditional archival materials. We will be capturing records. We will be describing them, arranging them, preserving them, and providing access to them in roughly similar types of workflows as to those we use with paper-based records. So those are the knowns. The knowns are, we will take this life cycle-based approach. We will use OAIS to guide what we do. On this life cycle issue, for me, the big unknown right now is, can this whole account approach or this life cycle approach adopt itself well to personal records? And even assuming that we make the decision to pursue capstone approaches to identify particularly important records creators, will it work for those who don't have good management going on? I'm thinking here actually internally we have two very important collections we're dealing with right now that include email. The first of those is a gentleman who's been fortunate enough to, an engineering professor actually, who's been fortunate enough to have an assistant throughout his entire career at Illinois. Very much the exception. This does not happen very typically. His records are very well arranged. The staff is very eager to open email access up to us and very willing to do that. This is Nick Koloniak, who's professor of electrical engineering, who was the inventor of the LED. On the other hand, we have another faculty member who passed away who had no assistants or secretary along, a person who is very influential in evolutionary biology, in contact with everyone from Charles Darwin, Karl Popper, all kinds of philosophers, historians of science, and other individuals, but we find a very big gap in his collection from the early 1980s through about 2000 or so, at which point we have his email records. So no management, nothing left there to preserve. Okay, so back to my knowns and unknowns here. In 5 different areas, I'd like to just briefly summarize kind of what I've heard today in terms of pre-custodial approaches and appraisal. What do we know? We know that we probably are never going to be getting good decision-making by those who create records as to what to keep or what to save. It just is not going to happen. We can and should provide guidance. In fact, people ask us for guidance all along. We should provide it, but we should not certainly depend on it being done. That is very much a known. Another known is that macro appraisal really is the way to go, and I would really like to tip my hat here to the National Archives for, in essence, blessing this approach for the rest of the archives, historical societies, and so forth around the country with the capstone model, which I think is an excellent one. I agree in general that identifying particularly significant records creators is more likely to have success. What is unknown on this pre-custodial and appraisal point? I think it's very much unknown at this point as to how or even whether we can do appraisal on an item level or even a folder level. In fact, I'm not convinced that this problem is essentially soluble in any respect. I did very much like what Anthony was suggesting, trying to do social network analysis within individual email accounts. I see that as really a good application of sort of traditional archival theory, looking at the provenance of the records, where they came from, and who might have been significant correspondents. I'll be very interested to see how this social networking element plays out using natural language processing and semantic analysis tools, which will really be necessary if we were to make any kind of appraisal decision. Okay, but I think on the appraisal side, the really big sort of elephant in the room is, how are we going to deal with private or confidential information? As people have talked about, PII is the least of our worries. Anybody can run a program to do Social Security number identification and pull it out. But what do you do about letters of recommendation? We actually had a very interesting sort of early experiment at Illinois where we took the email records of Carl Woese, who was this professor I was mentioning to you. I got all excited because we'd found some nice topic modeling software. So I thought, oh, we'll just throw it in there and I'll send it over to his most recent assistant and say, hey, does this offer a good model for access? And she sent me a message back about 10 minutes after I emailed her, no, you can never release this. It contains all kinds of confidential information. So I think these topic modeling approaches can work pretty well, but they have to be done in consultation with the records creator, and that's where tools like I think EPAD can play a really good role for us. Okay, on the capture side, which is the second part of our OAS model, receiving things into the archives, I think we actually at this point have pretty good stability about what to do and how to do it. We know that there are capture tools available that work pretty well. You know, I granted and take the point that there are going to be proprietary formats that come along and will require additional effort. But by and large, for the most part, there are tools which are relatively easy to use that can and will allow us to ingest email and get it into some sort of minimally preservable format. Aid for Mail is a good one. Email Alchemy is another good one. Gmail has export tools. Most repositories will not have a problem getting the email into some kind of minimally preservable format. I do think we also know on this capture side that, I don't remember who it was mentioned the MacGyver approach, but I think that's going to be the model going forward for us. Susan Thomas from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England, made this point several years ago as well, is you have to be open to using as many possible tools as possible to get materials and then transforming them into some kind of minimally preservable format, which I think in most cases at a baseline level will end up being an MBOX file or something like that. Okay, so that's a little bit of a known issue, and there really are very few unknowns, I think, in terms of capture at this point. I think as a community we should be reasonably confident knowing that we can capture email. I think, you know, looking again to our OAS model, the next stage in the process of ingest is typically processing. And I think here again there are some pretty good known items at this point. What I took away from all the presenters today is that they were able to find a way to process emails that fit in pretty well with whatever infrastructure they currently had in place, but where you tried to set up a different infrastructure or something that sat beside your existing tools or services, it became infinitely more complex and difficult to do. So what I like to think of here is a little bit of a teeter-totter or maybe a balance point where on the one hand we know that we have a set of tools in our repository for providing access to materials, for ingesting them, for arranging and describing them. And on the other hand, we know we have certain staff capabilities. We know we have the ability to provide access in a particular way. So it seems to me that repositories are having the most success when they don't try to reinvent the wheel with using new technologies to do access. Again, as a known, I think we can say for the most part that our typical archival information packet, if you will, for email is going to consist of an account that is being preserved. The account is the object that we're trying to preserve, not the individual messages first and foremost. So by taking an account level approach, we apply traditional archival theory, which works from the top down in an increasingly, in a good enough way to begin with, and can kind of go to additional levels of granularity as we need to with minimal collection level descriptive records in our existing systems, but then working through to additional finding aids and so forth as we need to. I think on the sort of intellectual and physical control side, on the processing side, there also is a very big sort of unknown, and that is how are we going to sort and classify materials in a way that makes sense not only to the user but that preserves the provenance of the materials as well. you know, there are methods that we can use as humans. I was actually impressed that Anthony seemed to be able to get through 10 email messages per minute, classifying them manually. I thought, I really wish I had that level of concentration, you know, when I'm working on any of my tasks at work. But how do we really apply those tools in a more machine learning sense? So we don't know right now exactly how the machine classification will work, and it's really an area that's ripe for research and analysis. I think within 3 to 5 years we will know a little bit better. Okay, so on the preservation side, again, working through our OAS model, there are some knowns and some unknowns. I think as a known item, we know that MBOX or EML or one of the RFC-based standards are good enough as a short-term preservation format, but as an unknown, we don't know yet what the best long-term preservation format is. I think in theory, XML based format, the type of format that Rick was talking about and Linda, really make perfect sense as a preservation object, but unfortunately without systems to display them and analyze them, we can really not count on XML as anything other than sort of a self-described preservation format. So we really don't have any solid information or direction at this point as to what the best preservation format for email is. And again, this is an area for additional research and development. Also on the preservation side, again, I don't want to beat the attachment or the link issue totally to death, but it is a huge one. It's, certainly in the short term, it's a pretty clear strategy to use the MBOX format and just keep attachments in their MIME state, and that's very fine in the short term, but in the long run, how are we going to normalize files and then provide access to those as they age and as they become less known to us? And then finally, on the access side, I do think we have a very big known, to me, takeaway from today, and that is just a reinforcement of a point that Brewster Kahle likes to make repeatedly, which is that access does drive preservation. One of the most impressive things I heard here today actually was in regard to the Kane email project. The fact that the emails are accessible gets attention for the archives and makes them more likely to be preserved over the long run. Dark archive approaches are not inherently bad, but when emails are accessible, there becomes a much greater likelihood of them remaining accessible because people begin to depend on them, and they gain some notoriety, if nothing else, for the archives. The big unknown issue, of course, on the preservation side, on the access side, is how can we do this responsibly, given the needs of not only our institutions, but the needs of third parties and others who are represented in email messages. And I think in this respect, as with archives, things come down always to the issue of trust, and having events like this where people share trust-building experiences really is an important one for us. So just summing up for me, these are some of the big takeaways from today, both what I know at this point, what will inform our own practice at Illinois as we begin building out our email preservation system, and some of the unknowns. I would say my big takeaway here, the most important thing for me, I think, is that really everyone can take some steps to do email preservation. It's not as hard as you think it's going to be once you sit down to do it, and there really is value in sharing information in the way that we have here today. So at this point, I would just like to open things up for a broad discussion. We do have some time left today, and I would just like to open things up for questions, comments, thoughts for myself or any of the speakers as a way of ending the day on a good note and on the theme of information sharing with each other. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, question back here. I'm going to preface this question as saying I'm a capstone supporter and champion. We've actually attempted to implement a capstone-like approach to the preservation of email at my institution. You mentioned in your earlier in your remarks that you guys are considering taking a capstone-like approach at your institution. One of my nagging concerns with capstone is that we're told that modern organizations are very decentralized in terms of their decision-making responsibilities, and that there are progressive appraisal strategies that suggest the important work of organizations is not being done at the executive level. And so one of my concerns is that if my institution focuses on preserving in toto the email accounts of senior executives, we may be missing something. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, if you've thought about that.
Right. Yeah, we have thought about that. In fact, when I get back on Thursday, we're having a meeting to discuss that among other issues. I guess as a baseline, we're in an academic setting, so everything is a lot more loosey-goosey in a lot of respects. And like you said, we know that a lot of the real decision-making percolates up from the bottom levels of the organization. I think what we're going to end up doing is pursuing sort of a modified capstone approach. So the latest thing we've been recommending is that there are a certain number of individuals based on their position that we have an automatic sort of watch based for them. So at what point they leave, a process would be triggered with IT where we work with the individual or the successor individual and the office. But then in addition to that, it is open enough so that individual faculty members and those who don't fall under some kind of an administrative appointment would also potentially either initiate contact with the archives, which happens quite frequently, or we would initiate contact with them ourselves. So it isn't just a matter of saying, yes, we know there are these important individuals and all of the rest of you can go get lost somewhere. There is a certain amount of flexibility based into it. There is a little bit of an assumption as well that we're making, is that even though some of the decision-making and ideas start off at lower levels within our administrative structure, they have a way of very quickly percolating up if they're important enough. So some of those things would get captured then just by virtue of being part of somebody else's account. And again, that's not a wholly sufficient approach, but it gets us a little bit closer to where we have been for something like the administrative subject files that we might have captured in the past from the dean of LAS or whatever college we're dealing with.
I'll go for it because I had a very similar concern about capstone, and I think Anthony's way of describing certain people as more significant and others as less significant might be a better way to look at it outside of, say, a government agency setting where I see the application of capstone fitting in better, but I'm not an expert on government agencies. I know for someone who works with congressional committee work, I attended a presentation just a couple weeks ago where one of our speakers was talking about email archiving and saying the exact opposite, that some of the lowest level people are very much involved in that process and it's important to capture their material. So I just would love to hear other people's perspectives on it. I'm not sure if capstone as a concept could be broadened to significant people versus executive leadership. I'm just curious about anybody else who's struggled with this.
So I'm Jenny Plana with the Department of Justice, and the analysis that we undertook, it's a little more of a bright line in federal agencies. We needed the top of each of the basically CFR components of the department and the approved organizational chart. So that's how we broke out the components. We did the top 2 levels because our theory was that in terms of we were handling cases and projects separately, and what goes on at the top 2 levels, of course, is all the policy making. And by capturing the top 2 levels, what we hope to capture was sufficient underlying information on which the top level made final decisions, so that we would at least get the underlying recommendations and then the final decisions. We gave some guidance to each component in choosing who would be considered capstone below the top 2 levels. And we have several organizations who have chosen a selection of other positions within their component that, for whatever reason, provides guidance and recommendations that are the foundational pieces of the decision making. So that's basically how we did it. I mean, as I say, it's kind of easy at some level in a federal agency. You got a CFR that lays out who's at the top, but that wasn't the only basis of the decision. Conceptually, the idea was what information fed in to what were the final decisions and actions of the agency. So.
Hi, I'm with the grant-making arm of the National Archives, and I just wanted to observe that I think it's worth further exploration looking at capstone as something that can capture organizational policy and decision-making, where beyond that, certain types of organizations are also known as either cultural repositories or knowledge, enhancing knowledge and furthering knowledge, and that there's a subject matter level to that that probably has a significant role to play in email capture and appraisal.
Yes.
For example,
Right.
you know, in an academic institution, you're going to have certain knowledge fields amongst your professors and others that they're not key decision makers at the organization per se, but they're critical to the culture of the institution at large, and in terms of what those individuals bring to the whole atmosphere of that institution and that organization. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Right, and I think it's important too to remember significant part of capstone, at least is how we think of it or how I would implement it, is in line with the repository's overall documentation strategy or collecting mandate. And of course, there are a lot of repositories. Mine is one that functions in this dual role, both as an institutional archives and as a collecting repository. So we have no mandate to tell faculty or students or alumni to deposit records with us, but we can still borrow elements of the capstone approach, which says, hey, if we're going to deal with your records, we really would like to deal with the whole account, and we would like to make a decision based on whether your records are suitable for our repository based on our documentation strategy. So it's not a simple records management approach that says, yes, you are at a particular level, therefore you're significant. No, you're not at that level, you're not significant.
And can I add a little bit to that? Is it part of, at a university, at a university, you also have leadership that's moving in and out of status between being just plain old professors and being leaders of departments. And so to take in the records management component of it that says, you know, after you leave being a department head and you're just a regular professor again, we're going to destroy your email after 7 years, that would never fly in a university, because professors are going to want to keep their research, you know, as long as they need it. So
right, and I mean, in this issue of the person versus the role-based, because the accounts, of course, adhere to or stick to the person. So actually, our current retired now president, who doesn't realize it yet, but he's going to be getting an email from me in a few days about his own records, was a student at the university, PhD student, actually an undergraduate student, a PhD student, a faculty member in, I think it was animal sciences, chair of animal sciences department, dean of the College of Agriculture, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, interim chancellor of the university, and eventually president. So which of those roles are we collecting? Well, in reality, my interest is less in the role and in the person ultimately, although at each level the types of records would be significantly different, and you know, require different management based on those roles.
I just had an observation thinking about the capstone approach, where you have what I've discovered in the Kane administration email is several of the cabinet secretaries had very little in their own email boxes because they were being managed by their assistants.
Right.
So I think you need to just keep that in mind about how the office actually worked and where that information is as you try to implement something like that. I mean, again, it's not a deal breaker, but it's something to keep in mind.
Right, it really does become a conversation. So we've noticed the same thing where there are actually multiple accounts with different you know, aliases and whatnot, and there's one real account where that the individual uses to actually do business through, and then there are all the other subsidiary ones that are managed by other individuals. So it really does require a detailed understanding of the organization and a consultation with the office.
I'm sorry, I was just going to follow up and say I wasn't, I mean, I think Roger's point is really good, and my point, I'm not quibbling with the entire account aspect of capstone, because that's something we've been doing for years, which is the entire account. I guess I was more focused on whose entire account, and
Right.
Roger raises a really good point about that, because
Right.
you're going to often find some very important stuff in somebody that might not have merited that at first glance or at just looking at an organizational structure. And that's where I have questions.
Yeah, fair enough.
I just wanted to make a quick kind of clarifying point, I guess, that it's important to remember, I think, that capstone is a records management tool for identifying permanent records, and a documentation strategy may encompass capturing records, but it may also encompass capturing a lot of other things, which is where I think the expansion is important
Right.
for collecting purposes.
Exactly.
I was just going to add too, along these lines of role versus the account, from a technical perspective, once a designee has been identified, it doesn't really matter if that's an individual person or a function. I mean, or if it goes below, say, the top officials level. If there's a process in place where basically you can call in a help desk ticket to IT and say, capstone this account, and it may be the administrative assistant's account, it may be something that arose out of an event like Deborah was speaking about. If there was a robust process just to capstone, you know, put those controls in effect, then you could alter the documentation policy as you need to, and not just strictly do it as quote unquote capstone officials.
Other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone again for really an excellent day. I've learned a lot. My head is kind of swimming and thinking about things to take back to work, and hopefully the same for all of you. Thanks again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.